Union soldiers on the other side until more Union soldiers showed up behind them. And the slaughter over here was just terrible. Crew came here not long after, and if you look behind you here, you can see one of the famous photos they took.
A faded Civil War photograph, hidden in a dusty attic for over a century, has finally been restored. At first, it seemed like any ordinary image of soldiers and officers. But when experts examined the background, they froze in disbelief.
Like the absolute nerd that I am, I was perusing the Library of Congress's website, and I came across a very interesting article about a photograph that was taken during the Civil War.
A shadowy figure appeared where no one should have been, revealing a secret that history never recorded. What was captured in that photo could rewrite everything we thought we knew. The discovery that shouldn't exist. Claire Donovan always believed that exploring family history would be a quiet, gentle activity. She imagined old stories, small surprises, and perhaps a few forgotten letters tucked away in drawers. She never imagined that a single afternoon in her grandmother's attic could shake the foundation of everything she thought she knew about history. The attic smelled of dry wood and old fabric, and every movement stirred dust motes that glimmered in the sunlight slipping through the small window. Most of the items had clearly been untouched for decades. Claire was patient by nature, so she methodically examined each corner, lifting boxes and peering under piles of old linens until a strange object finally caught her attention. It was a large leather trunk, darker than anything else stored in the attic. The leather had cracked with age, and the brass clasps were so dulled that they almost vanished against the worn surface. Claire felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as if the trunk itself were calling to her. She knelt, placing her hands on the cool, dry leather. For a moment, she paused, her heart beating faster without reason. Then she unclasped the trunk. The metal groaned as if it had been sleeping for 100 years. Inside, she found objects that seemed to belong to another lifetime. There were brittle letters tied with ribbons, some torn and stained with age. There were small war relics scattered on the bottom, uniform buttons etched with the Union Army emblem, and a heavy belt buckle that carried the weight of history in her hand. These were items families usually displayed with pride, yet they had been hidden as though someone wanted them to be forgotten. Beneath the relics lay a large leather-bound photo album. Its cover bore faded patterns, and its spine creaked when she opened it. The pages were yellowed, and the handwritten captions had an elegance that only time could give. Most photographs showed ordinary life in the late 19th century. Farm scenes, posed portraits, and streets long vanished. Claire turned each page slowly, savoring the quiet connection to the past. Then she noticed something unusual. The final page felt heavier than expected. Pressed beneath it, she found a small object wrapped in cloth. A thick wax seal held the cloth in place. The seal was dark red, cracked at the edges, yet it seemed almost impossibly preserved, as if someone had taken extraordinary care to hide the contents. Claire's breath caught. The object had clearly been hidden on purpose. She gently peeled away the wax, careful not to damage what lay beneath. As the cloth fell open, she froze. The photograph showed Abraham Lincoln sitting beside what appeared to be Ulysses Grant and several Union officers. It looked genuine. Every face was unmistakable. But the impossible part was the color. Lincoln's skin tones were natural, the uniform's bright blue, and the wooden chairs showed distinct grain. It looked like a modern photograph of men who lived over a century ago. Her mind spun. She remembered that mid-19th century photography could only produce black and white or sepia tones. Maybe it had been colored by hand, she thought. But as she held it closer to the window, the truth hit her. The color was not on the surface. It was embedded inside the material itself. A chill ran down her spine. This was something that should not exist. Claire carefully packed the photograph and knew she needed help. She made an appointment with Professor George Kramer, a renowned expert in photographic history, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She could not yet imagine what she would uncover next. A photo that breaks history. Professor George Kramer did not sleep well the night Claire showed him the strange photograph. His hands were still trembling slightly the next morning as he carried the sealed folder into the university's forensic imaging lab. Kramer had studied thousands of historical photographs, but this one disturbed him in a way he could not explain. He needed experts. He needed answers that only science could give. The lab was quiet when he arrived. Elsa, the university's conservation scientist, greeted him with curious eyes. She could sense from his strained expression that something unusual had come through the door. Mark, a chemist known for his research on early photographic emulsions, joined them soon after. He was already pulling on gloves before Kramer even opened the folder. Kramer laid the photograph on the examination table. Even under the sterile white lights, the colors appeared rich and natural. Lincoln's skin had warm undertones that no hand painter could ever imitate with such subtlety. The uniforms held a deep blue that looked strangely modern. Elsa leaned closer, her breath held in fascination. Mark simply stared for a long moment before whispering that this should not be possible. They began the tests without touching the image directly. Elsa used X-ray fluorescence to detect the elemental composition of the surface. A soft scan of light passed across the photograph as the machine registered data. Mark watched the screen carefully. The reading showed traces of organic pigments, possibly plant-based dyes, woven deep into the structure of the photograph. This immediate result confused all three of them. If someone had painted the photo by hand, the pigments would sit on top of the image. But here, the pigments were mixed inside the emulsion itself. Elsa adjusted the settings and ran microscopic scans. The cross-sectional images that formed on the monitor showed layers of silver-based chemistry. The pigment molecules were trapped within these layers, distributed in a way no known 19th century process allowed. It was as though the photograph had grown its own color from the inside. Elsa glanced at Kramer and said quietly that this was not the work of any forger. It was a process that should not exist for that time period. Mark tried to ground the situation in known history. He reminded them that James Clerk Maxwell had created one of the earliest color photographs in the 1860s by using 3 exposures filtered through primary colors. That method worked only under perfect conditions and never produced stable images. Louis Ducos du Oron had experimented with subtractive color processes around the same decade. His techniques were remarkable for the time, but were also fragile and unreliable. None of these early pioneers achieved anything close to the permanence seen in the strangest photograph lying on their table. Claire's photograph looked as though it had been taken yesterday, with a modern camera. Yet the material composition placed it firmly in the age of Lincoln. Mark shook his head and repeated again that this was scientifically impossible. The emulsion was consistent with 19th century silver albumin processes, but the presence of matured pigment molecules inside the emulsion made no sense at all. It suggested the existence of a hidden or lost technology that surpassed anything known from the era. As the data continued to scroll across the screen, the room felt colder. Elsa placed the photograph under an ultra-high magnification lens to examine the grain structure more closely. She adjusted the focus little by little. The image became clearer with every movement. Lincoln's coat appeared. The wood floor below him sharpened. The texture of a nearby curtain came into view. Then she froze. Her hand lifted away from the controls as though the lens had burned her. A strange expression crossed her face, a mix of fear and disbelief. She whispered that something was wrong with the background. When she zoomed further, the shape behind Lincoln became clear. There was a human figure standing in the shadows. The silhouette did not match anyone known from the scene. It did not belong there at all. The discovery of the mysterious figure standing between Lincoln and Grant changed everything. A face history tried to erase. Claire could not stop staring at the shadowed face that had emerged during Elsa's ultra-magnified scan. The man looked calm but intense, like someone who understood far more than he was saying. He wore no visible insignia. There were no stars, stripes, or known regimental symbols. He looked nothing like the soldiers around Lincoln. In fact, he looked more like a civilian who somehow found himself in one of the most important moments in American history. Claire felt a quiet ache in her stomach as she studied the face again and again. Something about the shape of his jaw and the distance between his eyes felt strangely familiar. She had seen similar features somewhere in her family albums. That thought stayed with her as Kramer suggested comparing the figure to the Donovan family's photographs. Claire returned home and gathered old tintypes, faded cartes de visite, and formal portraits that had been passed down through generations. She brought everything back to the lab. Together they laid the family images on a long table. Most were ordinary pictures of farmers, homemakers, and children dressed in Sunday clothes. But as Claire turned the pages of the old family album, she suddenly stopped. A portrait dated 1912 showed a stern-looking farmer standing beside a wooden fence. His eyes were deep-set. His nose was narrow. The expression was almost exactly the same calm yet distant look she had seen in the Civil War photograph. Her heart thumped. She placed the modern print of the Civil War image beside the 1912 portrait. Kramer leaned over the table and studied both pictures with great care. The resemblance was undeniable. The man from the mysterious color photograph looked almost identical to the farmer in the later picture. The caption on the family photograph read, "William Donovan." Genealogical records helped confirm the connection. Claire's great-great-grandfather was William Donovan, a name the family had mentioned but never fully explored. According to old muster rolls and census reports, William had joined the 104th New York Infantry as a medic during the Civil War. Family stories suggested he had served bravely, but without much detail. Official records listed him as missing in action on April 6 in 1865, during the final days of the Appomattox campaign. The date struck Claire immediately. The photograph clearly showed Lincoln and General Grant. It looked like it had been taken on April 9th, the day of General Lee's surrender, and there, standing behind Lincoln's chair, was William Donovan, alive and present. That single fact contradicted every historical document that claimed he disappeared 3 days earlier. It suggested something had been hidden, altered, or intentionally removed from the record. Claire felt a sense of disbelief mixed with pride and fear. Why would the War Department claim that William was missing if he had not only survived, but had stood beside some of the most important figures of the era? Had he been secretly reassigned? Had he witnessed something sensitive that required his name to be erased from public records? Or had he been involved in something the government did not want recorded at all? Kramer sensed the weight of the discovery. He grew determined to find any trace of William Donovan's final days. He spent hours in the Civil War archives, digging through letters, memos, and handwritten records that had never been digitized. One evening, while reading through a box of confidential War Department documents, he uncovered a small memo written in faded ink. It was dated near the end of the war. The paper mentioned the initials WD. Next to it was a cryptic reference to a person labeled only as Al. There were no explanations, only a short note that said their meeting must remain off record. Kramer felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that Al could stand for many things, but the date and context whispered something far more dangerous. Al might refer to Abraham Lincoln himself. If that was true, then William Donovan had been involved in something far greater and far more secret than anyone in Claire's family had ever imagined. Lincoln's secret unit and the Shadow Post revelation. Kramer spent the next several days surrounded by stacks of Civil War records, faded journals, and private letters written by men who had stood close to Abraham Lincoln. He was driven by one sentence in the confidential memo he had discovered. WD moved per Al's request to Shadow Post. The message was short, but every word carried weight. He suspected that Al was shorthand for Abraham Lincoln, written informally in private correspondence. It would have been a way for trusted officers to refer to the president in notes that were not meant for public eyes. He studied the memo again and again, wondering what Shadow Post meant. The phrase suggested an assignment that was not noticed, not recorded, and perhaps intentionally hidden. That alone felt dangerous. If Lincoln had quietly moved a medic like William Donovan into a concealed role, then something unusual had taken place in the final days of the war. Kramer searched for clues in military journals and diaries written by men who had worked near the president. Many famous accounts never mentioned anything unusual. But deeper in the archives, he found lesser-known diaries that described rumors of a small group who worked directly around Lincoln. These diaries mentioned names like Presidential Escort and Light Guard. They were spoken of almost like myths. The notes suggested that these men were not part of regular infantry records. They were chosen for quiet tasks and for close protection of the president during the most dangerous periods of the war. He found references that the Union Light Guard had served as a mounted escort for Lincoln. They had guarded the White House and even protected the War Department during critical moments. Some historians had confirmed that members of this guard were officially posted in Washington. However, there was nothing describing any group known as the Presidential Escort Committee. No rosters existed. No formal orders had ever been published. It was as if this group had existed just outside the edges of history, unnamed yet undeniably present. Another clue came from Lincoln's friend Ward Hill Lemon. Records described Lemon as acting in some capacity as a bodyguard, although his role was never officially defined. Kramer considered this important. If even Lincoln's closest protector operated in a twilight space between official security and informal duty, it meant the president had relied on unpublicized circles to keep him safe. Claire returned to the lab after gathering more family stories. She listened in growing disbelief as Kramer explained his findings. They then examined the photograph again with new purpose. Donovan's uniform looked simple at first glance, nothing like the more ornate dress uniforms worn by high officers. But under high-resolution digital enhancement, Elsa noticed something tucked beneath the lapel. The faint outline of an embroidered badge came into view. The letters were tiny, yet unmistakable. P.E.C. Claire whispered the words that formed in her mind. Presidential Escort Committee. It sounded secretive, important, and perhaps intentionally erased from public record. The letters looked worn but carefully stitched. This was not decoration. It was identification. It meant William Donovan had belonged to a group no one today officially recognized. Kramer decided they needed to test the threads of the badge to confirm the era. Elsa and Mark placed the fabric under a series of chemical tests to analyze the fibers. When the report arrived the next morning, the results stunned all of them. The thread contained golden metallic fibers, but they did not match any known embroidery material from the 19th century. They did not appear in any historic catalog of military tailoring. The fibers looked specially manufactured with a technique that should not have existed at that time. Kramer stared at the results with growing unease. If the badge belonged to a secret unit, then someone had gone to extraordinary effort to create materials that did not belong to ordinary military supply. But who had done this? And why had they needed something so advanced for a hidden committee that history never acknowledged? A message linked to Lincoln's assassination. Elsa took great care as she loosened the delicate fabric around William Donovan's lapel. Everyone watched in silence. The PEC badge had already shocked them, but she sensed there might be more hidden beneath it. The stitches were tight and old, yet the thread looked stronger than anything normally used in the Civil War period. As she slowly lifted the badge away from the uniform cloth, something unexpected appeared beneath it. Tiny letters, stitched so precisely that they were almost invisible, formed a short and chilling message. The hidden embroidery read, "Target verified. Stand until April 14th." For a moment, no one spoke. Elsa simply stared at the words, her face draining of color. Kramer leaned forward and read the message again, this time aloud, as if he needed to hear the words to truly believe them. Claire felt her breath catch in her throat. The date hit her with sudden force. April 14th was the night President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater. Claire had visited the theater on a school trip years earlier. She remembered the guide pointing to the famous rocking chair where Lincoln had been sitting when he was shot. The stitched message suggested that Donovan had been ordered to remain in position until that date. It was not a simple instruction for a guard. It sounded like the final command for someone placed extremely close to the president in the hours leading to the tragedy. If Donovan had been part of a hidden protective circle, then why had he been pulled away or removed from the official roster just when Lincoln needed protection the most? Claire remembered a faded family letter that she had found months earlier. It was written in uneven handwriting and signed W.D. The letter said, "If you ever find the photo with the chair, burn it." At the time, she had not understood the warning. Now the meaning took on a frightening shape. The chair could only refer to the rocking chair Lincoln sat in during the assassination. If Donovan had been near that chair or had been assigned to guard the president at that exact moment, then he had witnessed something the world was not meant to know. Kramer searched through his notes and compared the message to documented failures in Lincoln's security on the night of the assassination. He explained that the bodyguard on duty had been John Frederick Parker, a policeman with a troubling history of misconduct. Contemporary reports claimed that Parker had abandoned his post during the show. Some accounts said he went to a nearby saloon. When Booth entered Lincoln's theater box, Parker was nowhere to be found. The records of the time described this as a tragic failure, but Kramer wondered if there was more behind it. Claire took the embroidered message and placed it under a UV light source. Something strange caught her eye. Beneath the original thread, nearly invisible until illuminated, was another set of marks. Faint letters appeared in a lighter tone, arranged in a second layer of stitching. These markings were not embroidered with ordinary thread. They looked as if someone had written with ink that could only be seen under ultraviolet light. Claire photographed the hidden letters and sent the image to the chemical analysis lab. Hours later, the phone rang. Mark picked it up, expecting the same kind of routine update they always received. Instead, the voice on the other end trembled noticeably. The analyst spoke slowly, as if choosing every word with care. The ink, he explained, did not match any pigment used in the 1860s. It did not belong to any formula known from that century at all. Something about the ink belonged to a much later period, and no one could yet explain how or why it appeared beneath a message that should have been sown in the final days of the Civil War. The technology that shouldn't exist. Kramer spent long hours digging through library archives and dusty special collections that most researchers barely touched. His attention finally settled on a set of old journal fragments written by men who claimed to have assisted Thomas S. O'Sullivan, the well-known Civil War photographer. These fragments had been donated decades earlier to the university's private archive, but had been dismissed as unimportant because many believed they were exaggerated stories. Now, with the strange photograph in their possession, Kramer read every page with new eyes. The journals described a confidential request from Abraham Lincoln himself. One assistant wrote that the president had sent a private note asking for a unique photographic plate. He called it a legacy image. The entry explained that Lincoln wanted a single chromatic plate unlike any other of its time. The instructions were described as highly secret. The writers mentioned a recipe that involved mixing organic dyes with silver-based emulsions. These dyes seemed to come from plant extracts, carefully refined and blended into the gelatin layer of the plate. Kramer paused to consider the weight of what he was reading. Modern scientific tests had already shown that Claire's mysterious photograph contained organic pigments inside the emulsion rather than painted on the surface. The old journal notes seemed to describe that very process. It was shocking because known experiments from that era had never produced a stable internal color system. Maxwell had created a 3-color photograph of a ribbon in 1861, but it required separate exposures and filters. The result was fragile and could not survive long periods of handling. Ducos du Oron had later worked on color processes using 3 images dyed in different colors, but his method still did not embed mature pigments inside a single plate. While Kramer studied the journals, Claire returned home to look again through the leather trunk she had inherited. She felt a tug in her chest, as if something inside the attic still waited for her. She opened the old album carefully, turning each page slowly. Most of the photographs looked ordinary. Finally, she reached the back cover, where the wax-sealed image had once been hidden. She touched the inside panel and felt something thin pressed behind it. Claire gently pulled the backing aside and discovered a small sealed envelope. It was yellowed, but intact. The writing on the front was simple. From Al. Claire stared at the 2 letters, her pulse rising with every passing second. She opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, faded by age, yet perfectly legible. The handwriting was precise and unmistakable. As the letters formed familiar shapes, her breath caught in her throat. It was written in the hand of Abraham Lincoln himself. The letter from Al. Claire unfolded the letter with trembling hands. The paper was thin, yellowed with age, and bore a careful, measured hand. The first line immediately drew her in. My dear W. It was addressed to William Donovan, and every word felt intimate, personal, and deliberate. She glanced at Kramer, who watched silently, his eyes reflecting a mix of awe and disbelief. Lincoln's words revealed a trust rarely shown in official documents. He referred to Donovan not merely as a guard, but as a watchful sentinel, a man who stands visible among those who do not. The language was poetic, yet precise, emphasizing that Donovan's role went far beyond ordinary duty. He had been chosen to witness, to protect, and to act in shadows that few could understand. The letter warned that history might forget Donovan entirely. His service was meant to remain secret, and his sacrifice invisible to the world. Lincoln wrote that the weight of his protection carried dangers too great for public knowledge. Should any threat rise, Donovan was instructed to safeguard the photographic plate at all costs. It must remain hidden, removed from official archives, for its truth was too powerful to be revealed in that era. As Claire read on, the letter became darker and more urgent. Lincoln spoke openly of repeated assassination plots, of the fragility of his presidency, and of the limitations of his public persona. No matter how carefully he moved, or how heavily guarded he appeared, he understood that outward appearances could never fully protect him. Donovan, however, had been chosen to stand where others could not, to hold the line unseen. The tone of the letter conveyed both responsibility and trust, a heavy burden passed from one man to another. After absorbing the weight of Lincoln's words, Claire and Kramer made a careful decision. They would not reveal the photograph or the letter to the public immediately. The world was not ready, and the truth might be too dangerous. Instead, they curated a private exhibit, giving it a name that captured Donovan's courage and secrecy: the man who stood anyway. The exhibit displayed the photograph in its full, impossible color: the embroidered PC badge, the hidden warning stitched under the lapel, and Lincoln's letter. Each piece told a fragment of the story, but together they revealed a hidden chapter of history. Claire and Kramer invited only those they trusted: Civil War historians, genealogists, and photographic conservators. The response was small but intense. Scholars debated the techniques used to create the plate. Descendants of soldiers and historians were drawn to the intimate human story. Even a few conspiratorial minds quietly observed, fascinated by the secrecy and layers of protection surrounding Donovan's service. The exhibit gave Claire a sense of accomplishment, but the weight of Donovan's hidden story never left her. She understood that this was more than a historical artifact. It was a carefully concealed message across time, meant to survive only if handled by those who could honor it. Then, one afternoon, while arranging documents for the exhibit, Claire's phone buzzed with a new message. It was a scanned telegram, fragile with age, marked Top Secret, and dated 1865. The sender was unnamed, a high-ranking War Department official, but the message itself was chilling. Destroy as ordered. No future risk. Claire's hands froze over the paper. Kramer leaned over, reading silently. The message confirmed their worst suspicions. Someone long ago had tried to erase Donovan, to wipe away the truth he had been guarding. The knowledge they now held was dangerous, not just for history, but for understanding the lengths to which powerful forces had acted to hide it. What do you think about Donovan's secret role and Lincoln's hidden message? Share your thoughts in the comments.